Every detail of my grandfather's visage remains etched in my memory. A tall, imposing figure, whose strength was as much a source of comfort as it was a wellspring of silent fear. He was a man of contrasts, a playful humor dancing in his eyes, yet a somber weight seemed to always linger in his presence, like a shadow that refused to part even in the brightest of days. My childhood was speckled with his laughter and the warmth of his stories, yet as I sit here, years after his passing, a chilling realization dawns on me. I never truly knew the man behind those smiles. As a child, I had a simplistic view of my grandfather. He was kind, never raising his voice, his demeanor as gentle as a summer breeze. But there was something unspoken, a hidden depth to his character that I could sense even then. My father once confided in me about Grandpa's tumultuous childhood. The tales painted a picture of a life so starkly different from the man I knew, it felt like peeling back layers of an old forgotten painting to reveal a darker, more complex image beneath. Grandpa was born into a secluded community nestled deep in the mountains, far from the reaches of modern civilization. This community, led by our great-grandfather, was a curious amalgamation of strict traditions and arcane rules. Their way of life, as my father described, was harsh, unyielding. It was a world where even children weren't spared from the brutalities of survival. Grandpa, even as a boy, had to fend for himself, foraging for food in the unforgiving wilderness. The community's isolated existence was shattered one fateful night. A disaster, so horrific in nature, descended upon them, leaving a trail of death and destruction. Many perished, and Grandpa, a mere child then, was found amongst the few survivors, battered and on the brink of death. The details of that night remain shrouded in mystery, lost in the echoes of the mountains. Newspaper clippings from that era speak of an attack, but the truth remains elusive, buried under a pile of conjecture and forgotten memories. Grandpa's rescue from the ruins of his community marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Orphaned and scarred, both physically and emotionally, he was thrust into a world alien to him. My grandfather, having weathered the storm of his early life, emerged as a man of remarkable resilience. He excelled in academics, his name often synonymous with honor and achievement. His life, post the calamity of his childhood, was a portrait of triumph over adversity. He married my grandmother, a woman of gentle strength and quiet wisdom. Their love story was one of deep affection and mutual respect, blossoming into a family with my father as their first beacon of joy. As a child, visits to my grandparents were the highlight of my weekends. Their home was a treasure trove of stories and laughter. Grandpa, with his knack for conjuring tales from thin air, and Grandma, with her endless repertoire of games, turned their home into a wonderland for a curious child like me. Yet amidst all the merriment, there lingered a set of unbreakable rules, etched into the very fabric of our family life. The most stringent of these rules revolved around food. In Grandpa's house, food was sacred, a blessing not to be taken lightly. There was an almost ritualistic precision to how meals were prepared and served. Grandma, a masterful cook, would prepare dishes with such accuracy that not a single morsel was wasted. Seconds were a concept alien in their home. Portions were measured, adequate but never excessive. This reverence for food was rooted in Grandpa's harrowing childhood experiences. The scarcity he faced in the mountains had ingrained in him a deep-seated frugality, a respect for sustenance that bordered on the sacred. My father often remarked that Grandpa's stringent rules around food were a shadow of the traumas he had endured, a coping mechanism for fears that never quite faded. As a child, I found these rules cumbersome, often wondering why we couldn't simply enjoy food like other families. But as I grew older, I began to understand the gravity of those unspoken memories that governed Grandpa's behavior. His frugality was not mere habit, it was a silent scream from a past riddled with hunger and loss. Our visits, though filled with warmth, were always short-lived. Rarely did we stay overnight, a decision my father said was out of respect for Grandpa's unspoken boundaries. The inexorable passage of time has a way of altering landscapes, both physical and emotional. As I grew older, the vibrant visits to my grandparents' house became less frequent, fading into the background like an old photograph losing its colors. The reason for this gradual distancing was rooted in a painful reality: Grandpa's declining health. Grandpa, once a pillar of strength and stories, began to succumb to the cruel clutches of dementia. His lucid moments became rare, a flickering light in an ever-growing darkness. My parents, ever considerate of his condition, decided to limit our visits, not wanting to overwhelm him. Our family gatherings shrank to mere formalities, confined to the obligatory festivities of holidays. During these sparse visits, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes that time had etched into my grandparents' lives. Grandpa, once the heart of every conversation, now sat in quiet confusion, his eyes often glazed with a distant, unrecognizable gaze. The transformation was heart-wrenching, but it was Grandma's deteriorating state that truly alarmed me. Grandma, the unwavering force of warmth and nurturing, had withered into a shadow of her former self. The vivacious woman, known for her hearty meals and infectious laughter, now seemed fragile, almost ethereal. Her once radiant eyes were dulled by fatigue, framed by dark circles that spoke volumes of sleepless nights. The smile that used to light up the room was now a rare, fleeting ghost. She moved with a disconcerting slowness, her actions tinged with a forgetfulness that was uncharacteristic of the woman I knew. Meals, once a grand affair in their house, became simpler, often repeating the same dishes. Her once meticulous cooking now seemed like a task performed out of necessity rather than love. Her physical transformation was stark. The loss of weight made her appear brittle, as if a strong wind could whisk her away. It was a painful sight, watching the matriarch of our family diminish before our eyes. The conversations, once lively and engaging, were now punctuated by her absent-minded silences, her mind seemingly wandering to places we could not follow. As life's inexorable march continued, my own journey took me further away. College life, with its whirlwind of new experiences and challenges, meant moving to a different city. My connection with my grandparents, once a tangible thread of frequent visits and shared moments, was now relegated to the occasional letter, a feeble attempt to bridge the growing distance. The journey back to my childhood town, a trip I had made countless times before, felt different this time. The news of Grandma's declining health cast a somber shadow over my return. The vibrant memories of my visits were now tinged with a sense of impending loss. My parents, always protective, had shielded me from the grimmer aspects of my grandparents' situation. Discovering the truth was like a jolt, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. The thought that the once lively, indomitable woman I knew was now confined to her bed was a pill hard to swallow. The nurse who had been assisting them had left abruptly, a mystery in itself, leaving my grandparents in a vulnerable state. My parents, ensnared in the demands of their professions, were unable to provide the care my grandparents needed. It was without a second thought that I agreed to step in, a temporary guardian in their time of need. As I prepared for my stay, my father's parting instructions lingered in my mind. His request to ensure Grandpa was locked in his room at night seemed pragmatic, a necessary precaution for someone suffering from dementia. Sleepwalking was not uncommon in such cases, and the safety of both my grandparents was paramount. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, I arrived at my grandparents' house. The familiar structure, now seeming more like a relic of the past, stood solemnly against the twilight sky. My heart was heavy with apprehension, bracing for the reality that awaited within its walls. The sight that greeted me was a stark testament to the ravages of time and illness. My grandmother, once the very embodiment of vitality and warmth, was now a frail figure confined to her bed. Her world had shrunk to the four corners of her room, her days spent in silent contemplation of the ceiling above. Her voice, once filled with stories and laughter, had faded into a whisper, barely audible over the creaks of the old house. Grandpa, too, was a shadow of his former self. The robust, spirited man I remembered from my childhood had withered away, leaving behind a skeletal figure that seemed to be clinging onto life with a quiet desperation. His eyes, once brimming with a playful light, now held a haunting depth, a reflection of a mind trapped between the past and the present. Caring for them was a routine that I embraced with a mix of sorrow and determination. Feeding them their modest meals, bathing them with the gentleness of a courtier's hand, and changing their clothes became acts of love, infused with the weight of unspoken goodbyes. In these moments of intimacy, I found myself clinging to the remnants of the family we once were. It was during one of these routines that I experienced a fleeting connection with my grandfather. In a rare moment of lucidity, he recognized me. His face, usually clouded with the fog of confusion, lit up with a recognition that pierced through the veil of his dementia. He expressed his happiness at my presence with a weak smile that carried the echoes of his old self. It was a brief, yet profound moment, offering a glimpse into the man he used to be. As night enveloped the house, a feeling of loneliness settled in. I made my way to the room where the nurse had lived briefly before me. The house, with its creaking floors and whispering walls, seemed to be watching over me as I lay in bed. And then it dawned on me that I was sleeping in my grandfather's house for the first time. But the weight of the day's events had plunged me into a deep but inexorable sleep, and my dreams had become a tapestry of memories and unspoken fears. The night, shrouded in its eerie stillness, was abruptly fractured by a chilling sound that jolted me awake. It was a harsh, grating crunch, akin to the breaking of thick ice underfoot, followed by a series of heavy, dragging footsteps. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, the silence of the house now feeling like a heavy cloak wrapped around me. Gathering my courage, I slipped out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. The night air felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension that sent a shiver down my spine. Clutching a flashlight, its beam a small comfort in the overwhelming darkness, I tiptoed into the hallway. As I approached Grandpa's room, my heart sank. The door was ajar, the room empty, a haunting void. A wave of self-reproach washed over me for forgetting to lock it. With a sense of growing unease, I made my way downstairs, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight, breaking the oppressive silence. The kitchen, a place of warmth and family gatherings, now held a sinister air. As I stepped in, a chilling sensation crept over me. There, in the dim light, stood Grandpa, his figure grotesquely distorted in the darkness. Clad only in his nightgown, he was hunched over in the corner, holding a piece of raw meat on a bone. His actions were disturbingly animalistic, his mutterings unintelligible, a stark contrast to the man I once knew. The scene before me was macabre and surreal. Grandpa's movements were erratic and primal, reminiscent of a wild animal feasting on its prey. The sound that had awakened me, the gruesome crunching, was now horrifyingly clear. It was the sound of him biting into the raw, cold meat. His jaws moved with an unnatural wideness, his teeth, alarmingly sharp, grinding against the bone with a sickening ferocity. I stood frozen, the flashlight's beam fixed on this ghastly spectacle, my mind struggling to reconcile the image of my once gentle grandfather with the feral creature before me. The air was thick with the metallic scent of raw meat, and the sound of bone being crushed under human teeth echoed through the room, a sinister symphony that sent waves of revulsion through me. In the dimly lit kitchen, with the flashlight's beam quivering in my trembling hand, I found my voice barely escaping my throat, a mix of fear and desperate hope. "Grandpa?" I called out, my words laced with trepidation, an attempt to pierce through the nightmarish scene unfolding before me. The response was chilling. Grandpa's head turned towards me, the movement slow and eerily disjointed, like that of a marionette being manipulated by unseen hands. His eyes, rolled back to reveal bloodshot whites, stared at me with a vacant intensity that chilled me to the bone. It was a gaze that seemed to look through me, lost in a void where reason and recognition had no place. His mouth, smeared with blood, bore a grotesque contrast to the frail elderly man I knew. A piece of meat, raw and glistening, hung limply from his lip, swinging slightly as he moved. As he began to shuffle towards me, each step deliberate and unnerving, a low guttural sound escaped his throat. It was an unintelligible mooing, a sound so out of place and disturbing that it rooted me to the spot for a moment in sheer terror. When he lunged at me, a primal instinct took over. I leapt back, my heart pounding against my chest, and bolted towards the safety of my room. The sound of his footsteps, rapid and unsteady, followed me, accompanied by the continued crunch of bones and the sickening wet sound of tearing flesh. I reached my room in a panic, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed through the house. Pressing my back against the solid barrier, I tried to steady my ragged breathing, sweat coursing down my forehead. The noises from the hallway persisted, a cacophony of disturbing sounds that seemed to claw at the very edges of my sanity. For what felt like an eternity, the house was alive with Grandpa's unsettling presence. The mooing, the crunching, the shuffling footsteps painted a soundscape of horror that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Time stretched and contorted, each second an agonizing eternity. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The footsteps grew fainter, retreating towards Grandpa's room. The house settled back into its ominous silence, but the residue of fear lingered, a palpable entity in the darkness. Lying awake in my room, I could hear the distant, soft snoring of my grandfather, a sound so mundane yet so surreal in the aftermath of what had transpired. I still couldn't sleep. The first light of dawn brought with it a deceptive sense of normalcy, as if the terrors of the night had been nothing but a figment of my imagination. I cautiously left the sanctuary of my room, every step resonating with the echoes of last night's horror. In the living room, a scene of mundane tranquility unfolded. Grandpa was there, seated comfortably in his favorite armchair, his eyes fixed on the television screen. The gentle morning light streaming through the windows belied the darkness that had engulfed the house mere hours ago. He greeted me with a broad smile, the warmth in his expression a stark contrast to the grotesque image etched in my memory. His offer of coffee, made with casual normalcy, left me momentarily speechless. I declined, my voice barely hiding the tremor of unease. Seeking some semblance of understanding, I ventured to ask him about his activities during the night. His response was chillingly nonchalant. He claimed to have slept soundly, punctuating his reply with a cheerful remark about a dream filled with a delicious blood steak. His demeanor was unsettlingly normal, a facade that masked the disturbing events of the night. Retreating to my room, I reached out to my father, my voice a mix of confusion and fear. His reaction, a blend of agitation and resigned understanding, offered little comfort. He explained that Grandpa's bizarre behavior was not new, a consequence of the deep-seated trauma from his childhood, now exacerbated by his dementia. His words were a somber reminder to remain vigilant and cautious. From that day forward, I was diligent in securing both my room and Grandpa's each night. The routine became a ritual, a necessary precaution to guard against the unpredictability of his condition. The following days settled into a pattern of oppressive stillness, punctuated by the heavy, restless pacing of Grandpa in his room. The sound, initially a source of fear, gradually became a familiar part of the nightly routine, a grim soundtrack to our coexistence. Amidst this strained tranquility, Grandma's condition continued to deteriorate. Her world, once filled with the sounds of her laughter and the warmth of her presence, had shrunk to the confines of her bed. Her decline was silent, devoid of any dramatics or fanfare. In the end, her passing was as peaceful as it was somber. She slipped away in her sleep, a gentle departure from a world that had slowly faded around her. Her death marked not only the loss of her presence, but also the closing of a chapter in our family's history. The days following Grandma's passing were a blur of somber activity, with my parents immersed in the solemn duties of organizing her funeral. Left alone to care for Grandpa, I found myself enveloped in a deep melancholy, a sadness that I masked in an effort to maintain a facade of strength. I couldn't let Grandpa see the tears that threatened to spill, knowing his moments of clarity were fleeting amidst the fog of his dementia. Grandpa's condition had grown more unpredictable. There were stretches of quiet where he seemed lost in his own world, oblivious to the sorrow that hung over the house. But then, without warning, reality would penetrate the haze of his mind, and he would be overcome with grief. His sobs were heart-wrenching, the raw emotion of a man mourning his lifelong companion. The day of the funeral was marked by a relentless downpour, the skies weeping as if in mourning with us. The heavy rain caused a delay in the ceremony, an additional layer of gloom on an already somber occasion. As evening approached, the sky darkened further, casting a pall over the house. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with grief and unspoken despair. Grandpa and I sat in solemn silence near Grandma's coffin, a chilling reminder of the finality of death. In an attempt to find some respite from the oppressive atmosphere, Grandpa asked for a glass of water. Reluctantly leaving his side, I made my way to the kitchen. Returning to the room, the scene that unfolded before my eyes was one of unimaginable horror. The coffin, once a dignified resting place, was now tilted and askew on the floor. Grandma's body lay beside it, her pose unnaturally twisted, a grotesque parody of sleep. But it was the sight of Grandpa that froze my blood. He sat beside her, his demeanor one of primal hunger. His eyes, wide and unseeing, rolled back in a frenzy of madness. The sound that escaped his lips was a guttural, animalistic mooing, a chilling echo of the nightmarish events of days past. In a moment of unspeakable horror, I witnessed Grandpa sink his teeth into Grandma's face, tearing at her with a wild abandon. The grotesque sound of flesh being rended, the sight of my once gentle grandfather reduced to a feral creature, was a descent into a nightmare I had never imagined. Frozen in shock, my mind struggled to process the ghastly scene before me. The realization that Grandpa was desecrating the body of his beloved wife, the woman he had shared a lifetime with, was a blow that shattered any remnants of normalcy. The room, once a quiet space of mourning, erupted into a scene of sheer terror. My screams, shrill and desperate, filled the air as I called for help, a plea lost in the chaos of the moment. My eyes, wide with horror, were fixed on the monstrous transformation of my grandfather. He stood before me, no longer the man I knew, but a creature from the darkest recesses of nightmare. His appearance was grotesque, akin to a humanoid werewolf, something ripped from the pages of a horror story. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, bore into me with a feral intensity that sent chills down my spine. His hands, now grotesquely transformed, were marked with protruding blue veins, a stark contrast to his unnaturally pale skin. His face, once familiar and comforting, was now a mask of terror, twisted and contorted into an expression of hunger and savagery. The creature that bore a haunting resemblance to my grandfather was a living nightmare, its very presence a blight upon the natural world. As it turned towards me, a primal fear took hold, rooting me to the spot in a paralysis of dread. In a sudden, swift movement, the creature lunged. Instinctively, I raised my hand in defense, a futile gesture against the onslaught. The pain was immediate and searing as its teeth sank into my flesh, piercing through skin and muscle with terrifying ease. A rush of heat surged through my body, followed by an overwhelming wave of agony. The world around me began to blur, my vision tunneling as I teetered on the brink of consciousness. In the midst of my torment, the sound of arriving relatives broke through the haze. My father, his face a mask of horror and disbelief, led the charge. They grappled with the creature, struggling to pull it away from me. The room was a cacophony of shouts, growls, and the desperate scuffling of a struggle for survival. When they managed to pull my grandfather away from me, I was quickly carried away, and pain became my constant companion as I slipped in and out of consciousness. The last thing I remembered before I fell into darkness was the lights of the ambulance flickering in the night. Rushed to the hospital, the world faded into a void of pain and unconsciousness. Days, heavy with the weight of recent horrors, passed in a blur of anxious discussions and somber decisions. My parents, grappling with the grim reality of Grandpa's condition, resolved to move him to a specialized institution, a place where trained professionals could provide the care and supervision he now desperately needed. The news of his impending transfer was met with a disquieting calmness from Grandpa. His once vibrant personality had been steadily eroded by the relentless progression of his disease. Each day he seemed to drift further away, losing touch with the people and the world around him. As time marched on, leaving its indelible marks on our lives, the shadows of those harrowing nights continued to haunt me. Despite the passing years, the traumas of the past refused to fade into obscurity. Nightmares plagued my sleep, a chilling echo of the bone-crunching terror that once reverberated through my grandparents' house. The specter of those memories lingered, manifesting in phantom pains that gripped my arm, a constant reminder of the fateful night when the unthinkable became reality. The sound of bones being crushed, once an external horror, now resonated in the recesses of my mind, a haunting melody that refused to be silenced. Life, however, continued its inexorable march. I graduated from college, embraced the joys of marriage, and found solace in the blossoming of my own family. Yet, the scars of the past remained, a hidden undercurrent in the river of my existence. As I watched my son play, his innocence and beauty a stark contrast to the darkness that once enveloped my life, a disturbing thought would occasionally surface. He's so small, so beautiful, so funny and so yummy. Why do I want to eat him?